My sister announced her engagement to my ex-husband at my wedding. Then I revealed his truth. The morning sun painted the rolling hills of Sunset Ridge Vineyard in shades of gold and amber, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured rows of grapevines. I stood at the window of the bridal suite, watching the staff arrange white roses and baby's breath along the ceremony arch, my heart hammering against my ribs in a rhythm that had nothing to do with pre-wedding nerves. "Vanessa, you look absolutely radiant. My maid of honor, Sarah," whispered as she adjusted the delicate lace train of my ivory dress. "Jonathan is going to lose his mind when he sees you." I smiled, but my eyes remained fixed on the vineyard below. If only she knew the real reason I chose this place. At 38, I never thought I'd be doing this again. The white dress, the vows, the hope that maybe this time would be different. But Jonathan wasn't Blake. Jonathan was steady, honest, real. He was the kind of man who brought me coffee in bed every morning and remembered the names of my coworkers. He was the kind of man who, when I told him I wanted to get married at this specific vineyard, simply nodded and said, "Whatever makes you happy, Van." He had no idea this was where my first marriage had died. The irony wasn't lost on me. 3 years ago, I'd bought this vineyard in secret, pouring every penny from my divorce settlement into restoring what had once been a crumbling estate. The same estate where Blake had promised to love me forever, where we'd danced under string lights that now hung in the same spots, where he'd whispered sweet lies into my ear before disappearing from my life like morning mist. "Are you nervous?" Sarah asked, mistaking my silence for jitters. "No," I said and meant it. "I'm ready." Ready for what, exactly? I wasn't entirely sure. But 3 months ago, I'd found something in the vineyard's old office that had changed everything. A leather journal, forgotten in a desk drawer, containing words that had haunted me ever since. Words that Blake had once claimed he'd written just for me. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. "Vanessa? It's time," called my wedding planner, Monica, her voice bright with a kind of forced cheer that comes with expensive event coordination. I took one last look at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back was stronger than the one who'd stood in this same spot 6 years ago. This time, I wasn't the naive 32-year-old who believed in fairy tales. This time, I was in control. The ceremony was perfect. Jonathan's eyes misted as I walked down the aisle, his warm smile erasing years of doubt and pain. When he slipped the ring onto my finger, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Genuine happiness. The kind that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be. "You may kiss the bride," Pastor Williams announced, and Jonathan's lips met mine with a tenderness that made my chest tight with emotion. The crowd erupted in applause, and for a moment, I forgot about everything except the man holding my hand. We were married. We were happy. We were. "Vanessa." A familiar voice cut through the celebration like a blade. "My beautiful big sister." I turned and there she was. Chloe, my younger sister, striding through the crowd in a stunning emerald green dress that probably cost more than most people's rent. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her smile dazzling, and she was heading straight for me with the kind of confidence that had always made me feel small. We hadn't spoken in over a year. Not since the divorce, when she'd made it clear that she was staying neutral in the whole mess. Neutral. As if my marriage falling apart was some kind of debate rather than the most painful experience of my life. "Chloe," I managed, forcing a smile as she pulled me into a hug that smelled like expensive perfume and champagne. I wasn't sure you'd come." "Are you kidding? I wouldn't miss this for the world." Her eyes were bright, glittering with something I couldn't quite identify. "Besides, I have some news of my own." Before I could ask what she meant, she was already moving away, her heels clicking against the stone patio as she made her way toward the reception area. Jonathan squeezed my hand, his brow furrowed with concern. "Everything okay?" he asked quietly. I nodded, though something cold was settling in my stomach.
"Fine.
Just family stuff." The reception was in full swing when it happened. Guests were scattered across the vineyard's terrace, laughing and talking as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. I was standing near the head table, accepting congratulations and trying to ignore the way Chloe kept glancing at me from across the room when she suddenly appeared at the DJ booth. "Excuse me," she said to the DJ, her voice carrying across the crowd. "Could I borrow the microphone for just a moment?" My blood turned to ice. "What is she doing?" I whispered to Jonathan. Before he could answer, Chloe's voice filled the air, amplified and crystal clear. "Hi, everyone. I'm Chloe, Vanessa's sister." She paused, waiting for the crowd to quiet. I know this is supposed to be about the happy couple, but I just couldn't wait to share some exciting news. The world seemed to slow down. I watched in horror as Chloe raised her left hand, a diamond ring catching the light. "I'm engaged," she announced, her voice ringing with triumph. The crowd murmured politely, a few people clapping. But I knew this wasn't the end of it. Chloe had never been one to settle for polite applause. "And I want you all to meet my fiancé," she continued, gesturing toward the back of the crowd. "Blake Morrison." The name hit me like a physical blow. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. And there, emerging from behind a cluster of shocked guests, was the man who had destroyed my life. Blake looked exactly the same. Tall, dark-haired, with the kind of easy smile that had once made me believe in forever. He was wearing a navy suit that I recognized, the same one he'd worn to our engagement party, and his eyes found mine across the crowded terrace. He had the audacity to smirk. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of someone dropping a wine glass. I could feel every eye in the place on me, waiting for my reaction, waiting to see if I would break. But I didn't break. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. I smiled. "Well," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the stunned crowd, "isn't that interesting?" Jonathan's hand found mine, his grip steady and reassuring. But I barely felt it, because as I looked at Blake, at my sister's triumphant expression, at the chaos they thought they'd created on my wedding day, I realized something. They had no idea what they'd just walked into. This vineyard wasn't just where my first marriage had ended. It was where Blake's carefully constructed house of lies was about to come crashing down. And I was going to be the one holding the wrecking ball. The game was about to begin. The silence that followed Chloe's announcement felt eternal. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, feel the weight of 100 curious stares. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Oh my God," under their breath. A waiter froze mid-pour, champagne spilling onto the stone terrace. But I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I simply stood there, my hand still in Jonathan's, watching as my sister basked in what she clearly thought was her moment of triumph. "Vanessa?" Jonathan's voice was barely a whisper. "Are you okay?" I squeezed his hand, my smile never wavering. "I'm perfect," I said, loud enough for the nearest guest to hear. "Absolutely perfect." The crowd began to murmur, conversations resuming in hushed tones. I watched Blake make his way through the guests, his confident stride unchanged. He looked older, maybe a little grayer at the temples, but that same arrogant set to his shoulders was exactly as I remembered.
"How long?"
I wondered. How long has this been going on? The answer came flooding back in fragments. Chloe's sudden absence from family gatherings after my divorce. The way she'd avoided my calls, claimed she was too busy to meet for coffee. The mysterious new apartment she'd moved into last spring, the expensive clothes, the sudden trips to work conferences that never seemed to add up. "Blake." My Aunt Margaret's voice cut through the tension. "What a surprise to see you here." He reached our group, his smile practiced and charming. "Margaret, you look wonderful." "Hello, Vanessa." His eyes met mine and I saw something there. Amusement? Challenge? "Congratulations on your wedding. You look beautiful." The nerve of him. The absolute, breathtaking nerve. "Thank you," I replied, my voice steady. "And congratulations to you both. When did this happen?" Chloe practically bounced as she rejoined us, her arms sliding possessively around Blake's waist. "Last weekend. We went to that little cafe in Napa where you two used to." She stopped abruptly, her cheeks flushing. "I mean, where we had our first date." "Where we had our first date." The words hit me like a slap. The same cafe, where Blake had proposed to me 6 years ago. The same corner table where he'd gotten down on one knee and promised me forever. How romantic, I said, and meant it. Because it was romantic in the most twisted way possible. Blake wasn't just moving on, he was recycling. Like some kind of emotional hoarder who couldn't be bothered to create new memories. "Vanessa," Blake said, his voice dropping to that intimate tone I remembered too well. "I hope there are no hard feelings. I know our divorce was difficult." Difficult. As if his sudden announcement that he was no longer in love with me, followed by his disappearance with half our savings, was simply a minor inconvenience. "Oh, no hard feelings at all," I said, lifting my champagne glass. "In fact, I think this calls for a toast." The crowd quieted again, sensing another dramatic moment. I could see Sarah looking at me with wide, worried eyes. Jonathan's grip on my hand tightened slightly. "To Blake and Chloe," I began, my voice carrying across the terrace. "May you find everything you're looking for in each other." There was scattered applause, uncertain and awkward. But I wasn't finished. "You know," I continued, "it's funny how life works out. Blake, I have to thank you. Our divorce was the best thing that ever happened to me. It led me to Jonathan, to this beautiful vineyard, to the life I was meant to have." I gestured around us, taking in the rolling hills, the perfectly arranged tables, the string lights beginning to twinkle as dusk approached. "This place has such special meaning to me," I said, watching Blake's face carefully. "I bought it 3 years ago, actually, after our divorce. I've been restoring it, piece by piece, turning it into something beautiful again." A flicker of something, confusion? Concern. Crossed Blake's features. Good. He was starting to realize that this wasn't quite the ambush he'd planned. "It's amazing what you can find when you're renovating an old place," I continued, my tone conversational. "So much history. So many forgotten things tucked away in drawers and closets." Chloe was frowning now, her earlier confidence beginning to waver. "What do you mean?" "Oh, just old papers, photographs, journals. You'd be surprised what people leave behind." I took a sip of champagne, savoring the moment. But enough about the past. Tonight is about the future. About new beginnings and fresh starts. I raised my glass higher. "To truth," I said, my eyes locked on Blake's.
"To honesty."
"And to getting exactly what we deserve." The crowd raised their glasses, the toast echoing across the vineyard. But Blake didn't drink. He was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something like fear. "Now," I said, setting down my glass and taking Jonathan's arm, "shall we dance? I believe the bride and groom have a first dance to finish." As we moved toward the dance floor, I could feel Blake's eyes following us. Could sense Chloe's growing confusion as she began to realize that her grand gesture hadn't gone quite as planned. But they had no idea what was coming. No idea that every word I'd just spoken was carefully calculated, every smile a promise of what was to come. The real show was just beginning. The first dance with Jonathan should have been magical, and it was in a way. His hands were steady on my waist, his eyes full of love and concern as we swayed to At Last by Etta James. But my mind was elsewhere, traveling back to a rainy Tuesday morning 3 months ago when everything changed. "You're thinking about something else," Jonathan murmured, his breath warm against my ear. "Want to tell me what's really going on?" I smiled up at him. This wonderful man who deserved so much better than a wife plotting revenge at their wedding reception. "Later," I promised. "I'll tell you everything later." And I would. Jonathan knew about Blake, about the divorce, about the pain I'd carried for years. What he didn't know was what I discovered in the vineyard's old office, or how perfectly it was all falling into place. It had been a routine cleaning day. I'd been going through the main house, preparing to convert the old owner's office into a tasting room, when I found it. A leather-bound journal, wedged behind a drawer that had been sticking for months. The cover was worn smooth, and when I opened it, I recognized the handwriting immediately. Blake's handwriting. The journal was filled with notes, ideas, and drafts. But it was the pages near the back that made my blood run cold. Page after page of wedding vows, written in Blake's careful script. My wedding vows. The ones he'd read to me on our wedding day, the ones that had made me cry with their beauty and sincerity. Vanessa, from the moment I saw you, I knew my soul had found its home. You are the melody to my silence, the light that guides me through every storm. I promise to love you not just in the sunshine, but in the rain. Not just in laughter, but in tears. You are my today, my tomorrow, my always. I remembered every word. How could I forget? They were supposedly written just for me, born from Blake's heart in the weeks before our wedding. He'd told me he'd stayed up nights crafting them, wanting them to be perfect. But there, in his own handwriting, were multiple versions. Drafts. Edits. And at the top of the page, in Blake's neat print, template, wedding vows, version 3.0. Template. My hands had shaken as I flipped through the pages. There were notes about different venues, different dates, different names scratched out and replaced. Sarah became Jessica. Jessica became Michelle. Michelle became me. I'd felt sick. Literally physically sick. But I'd kept reading. There were notes about engagement rings. Vintage style works best, appears more thoughtful, restaurant recommendations, intimate places with private booths for proposals, and even a checklist titled The Perfect Romance Timeline. Blake hadn't just cheated on me. He'd systematized romance itself. But it was what happened last week that confirmed my worst fears and gave me the ammunition I needed. I'd been having lunch with our cousin Emma when Chloe joined us, practically glowing with excitement. She'd been gushing about Blake's proposal, about how romantic it was, how he'd written the most beautiful vows for their engagement ceremony. You have to hear this, she'd said, pulling out her phone. He wrote them himself, just for me. Listen to this part. And then she'd read them, word for word, line for line, the exact same vows Blake had supposedly written for me. Chloe, from the moment I saw you, I knew my soul had found its home. You are the melody to my silence, the light that guides me through every storm. Emma had looked confused, glancing between Chloe and me. But I'd simply smiled and nodded, my heart pounding as the final pieces fell into place. That night, I'd called a private investigator. Within 2 weeks, I had everything I needed. Blake's pattern wasn't just limited to recycled vows. He'd been engaged 4 times in the past 5 years. 4 different women in 4 different cities. The same ring, the same restaurants, the same carefully crafted timeline. And now, as I danced with my husband on the terrace of my vineyard, I watched Blake and Chloe at their table. She was leaning against him, her head on his shoulder, completely oblivious to the fact that she was just the latest victim in his elaborate con game. The poor thing, I whispered, and Jonathan looked at me questioningly. Nothing, I said, spinning under his arm. Just thinking about how sometimes the truth has a way of coming out at the most unexpected moments. The song ended, and guests began to clap. But I barely heard them, because across the terrace, I could see Blake watching me with growing unease. He'd always been good at reading people, and something in my demeanor was clearly troubling him. Good. He should be worried. Ladies and gentlemen, I heard the DJ announce, the bride would like to say a few words. I froze. I hadn't requested the microphone. But there was Chloe, standing at the DJ booth again, gesturing for me to join her. Come on, Vanessa, she called out. I thought you might want to thank everyone for coming to your beautiful wedding. The crowd was already turning toward me expectantly. Jonathan squeezed my hand encouragingly. I looked at Chloe, at Blake, at the faces of family and friends gathered in the golden light of my vineyard. And I realized that this was it. The moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for since the day I found that journal. Of course, I said, my voice carrying across the terrace. I'd love to say a few words. As I walked toward the microphone, I could feel Blake's eyes on me, could sense his growing panic as he began to understand that tonight wasn't going according to his plan. But it was definitely going according to mine. The microphone felt cool and solid in my hand as I stood at the center of the terrace, surrounded by the warm glow of string lights and the expectant faces of my wedding guests. This was my stage now. My vineyard. My rules. Thank you all for being here tonight. I began, my voice steady and clear. When I bought this vineyard 3 years ago, I never imagined I'd be standing here on my wedding day, surrounded by so many people I love. A murmur of appreciation rippled through the crowd. I could see my mother dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, Sarah beaming with pride, Jonathan watching me with that patient, loving expression that had made me fall for him in the first place. And there, at table 7, Blake was sitting rigidly upright, his jaw clenched. Chloe was still glowing, oblivious to the storm brewing around her. You know, I continued, this vineyard has such a rich history. The previous owners left behind so many treasures. Old photographs, letters, memories tucked away in forgotten corners. I paused, letting my eyes sweep across the crowd before landing on Blake. It's amazing what you can learn about people when you really start paying attention to the details. Blake's hand tightened around his wine glass. He knew. Somehow, he knew this wasn't going to be a typical bride's thank you speech. I want to tell you all a little story, I said, my tone conversational, almost chatty. It's about something I discovered recently. Something that changed my perspective on a lot of things. Jonathan was frowning now, clearly confused by the direction this was taking. But he trusted me. God bless him. He trusted me completely. A few months ago, while cleaning out the old office, I found a journal. A leather-bound book filled with the most beautiful writing. I smiled, the expression feeling sharp on my face. Poetry, really. Love letters. Wedding vows. Chloe perked up, interested. Several guests leaned forward. The vows were particularly moving, I continued. So heartfelt, so personal. They talked about souls finding their home, about being someone's melody, their light through every storm. I saw Blake go pale. Actually pale, like someone had drained the blood from his face. Beautiful words, I said. The kind that make you believe in forever. The kind that make you think you're the only person in the world who's ever been loved that way. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving. But here's the interesting part, I said, my voice dropping to an intimate whisper that somehow carried across the entire terrace. Those same beautiful, personal, heartfelt vows. They weren't quite as unique as I thought. I could hear someone's sharp intake of breath. Blake was staring at me with an expression of pure terror. In fact, I continued. Just last week, I heard those exact same vows again. Word for word, line for line, delivered to someone else by someone else, as if they were brand new. Chloe's smile was beginning to waver. Vanessa, what are you? It made me curious. I interrupted gently. So I started doing a little research. And you know what I found? I paused, savoring the moment. The entire vineyard was silent, except for the distant sound of wind through the grapevines. I found out that true love, apparently, has a template. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Blake started to stand, but I held up my hand, and somehow, miraculously, he sat back down. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, gesturing toward the large screen that had been set up to display our wedding photos, I'd like to share with you a little presentation. Monica, could you help me with the projector? My wedding planner, bless her professional heart, moved quickly to the AV setup. Within moments, the screen flickered to life. The first image was a photograph of a page from Blake's journal. His handwriting was clearly visible, along with the title at the top, Template, Wedding Vows, version 3.0. Gasps echoed across the terrace. Chloe's hand flew to her mouth. This is the journal I found, I explained calmly. Apparently, romance is a lot more systematic than I realized. The next slide showed a checklist, also in Blake's handwriting, the perfect romance timeline. Items included Week 1, intensive attention. Week 3, first I love you. Week 6, meet the family. Week 8, ring shopping. Efficient, I noted. Very organized. I could see guests turning to look at Blake, who was now slumped in his chair like a man facing execution. Chloe was staring at the screen in dawning horror. But wait, I said, my voice taking on the tone of a game show host. There's more. The next slide showed a series of receipts. Ring returns, restaurant cancellations, hotel bookings in different cities. It turns out, I said, that Blake has been quite the busy romantic. For engagements in 5 years, each one following the exact same pattern. The crowd was murmuring now, voices rising in shock and outrage. Someone shouted, "You've got to be kidding me." Chloe stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the stone. This can't be, Blake. Tell them this isn't true." But Blake wasn't saying anything. He was staring at me with something that might have been admiration if it weren't so terrified. "The ring Chloe is wearing," I continued, ignoring her distress, "is the same one Blake gave to Jessica Martinez in Phoenix last year, and to Michelle Chun in Seattle before that. It was even my ring, originally, my grandmother's ring, which Blake somehow managed to keep after our divorce." The sound Chloe made was somewhere between a sob and a scream, but I wasn't finished. "Now, I know what you're thinking," I said, addressing the crowd like we were having a pleasant conversation. "This is a wedding, not a courtroom. Why bring this up now?" I paused, letting my eyes find Blake's across the terrace. "Because," I said, "I believe in truth, and I believe that people deserve to know exactly who they're celebrating." The microphone crackled slightly as I leaned closer to it. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have one more surprise for you tonight. Someone who can verify everything I've just told you. Someone who knows Blake's pattern better than anyone." I gestured toward the back of the crowd, where a woman in a navy dress was slowly making her way forward. "I'd like you to meet Jessica Martinez, Blake's fiancée from last year. She flew in from Phoenix just for tonight." The crowd turned as one, following my gesture. And Blake looked like he was about to faint. "Jessica," I said warmly, "would you mind sharing your story with our guests?" Jessica Martinez stepped forward with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to lose. She was petite, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that had probably once looked at Blake the same way Chloe was looking at him now, with complete trust and adoration. "Hello, everyone," Jessica said, her voice clear and steady as she approached the microphone. "I'm sorry to crash the party, but when Vanessa contacted me last week, I knew I had to come." The crowd was dead silent, every eye fixed on this woman who had traveled across the country to expose a man's lies. Blake was gripping the edge of the table, so hard his knuckles were white. "Blake proposed to me 13 months ago," Jessica continued, "at a little cafe in Phoenix. He got down on one knee, pulled out this beautiful vintage ring, and recited the most romantic vows I'd ever heard." She turned to look directly at Chloe, her expression gentle but firm. "The same vows he apparently recited to you." Chloe's face crumpled. "No," she whispered. "No, that's not. Blake, tell her she's wrong." But Blake was staring at his hands, unable to meet anyone's eyes. "He told me the ring was a family heirloom," Jessica continued. "Said it had been his grandmother's. We planned the wedding for 6 months. I bought the dress, booked the venue, sent out invitations." She paused, her voice catching slightly. "Then, 2 weeks before the wedding, he disappeared. Left a note saying he'd realized he wasn't ready for marriage. Took the ring with him." The crowd was getting restless now. I could hear angry murmurs, someone saying, "What a piece of garbage," loud enough for everyone to hear. "But that's not the worst part," Jessica said, her voice growing stronger. "The worst part is what I found out later." She nodded to me, and I clicked to the next slide. The screen filled with a photograph of a woman with auburn hair and a bright smile, wearing the same ring Chloe had on her finger. "This is Michelle Chun," Jessica said. "Blake's fiancée before me. Same ring, same vows, same disappearing act. I found her through social media after Blake left me." Another click, another photo. This time a blonde woman in her 20s, radiant and happy. "And this is Sarah Patterson, Blake's fiancée before Michelle. Same pattern, same ring, same lies." Chloe was shaking now, tears streaming down her face. "You're lying," she sobbed. "You're all lying. Blake loves me. He chose me. He chose all of us," Jessica said, not unkindly. That's what he does. He finds women who are successful, independent, maybe a little lonely. He studies us, learns what we want to hear, then gives us exactly that. I stepped back to the microphone. Jessica, thank you for coming. I know this couldn't have been easy. Actually, Jessica said, it's been incredibly therapeutic. I've been wondering for months if I was crazy, if I'd imagined how perfect everything seemed before it all fell apart. I clicked to the next slide, and the screen filled with Blake's engagement folder, a manila file stuffed with printed emails, restaurant menus, and what looked like a detailed spreadsheet. This is Blake's system, I explained. He keeps track of everything. Which restaurants work best for proposals, which jewelers have the most flexible return policies, which cities have the shortest waiting periods for marriage licenses. The crowd was getting louder now, voices rising in anger and disbelief. Someone shouted, "How is this legal?" "Technically, it's not illegal," I said. "Just incredibly cruel." I clicked again, revealing a series of email exchanges between Blake and various wedding vendors. Cancellation requests, refund demands, all following the same pattern. Blake has perfected the art of the perfect romance, I continued, right down to the timing. He knows exactly when to say, "I love you," when to propose, when to disappear. It's all calculated. Chloe stood up abruptly, ripping the ring off her finger and hurling it at Blake. "You bastard," she screamed. "You lying, cheating bastard." Blake finally looked up, his face a mask of defeat and rage. "Vanessa," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You vindictive bitch. You planned this whole thing." The crowd gasped at his venom, but I just smiled. "I planned a wedding, Blake. A real one. With a man who actually loves me. You bought this place just to humiliate me," he continued, standing now, his facade finally cracking completely. "You orchestrated this entire evening." "No," I said calmly. "I bought this place to heal. To turn something broken into something beautiful. You showing up tonight was just a bonus." Jonathan stepped forward, his usually gentle demeanor hardened with protective anger. "I think you need to leave," he said to Blake. "Now." Blake laughed bitterly. "Leave? This is rich. You're all acting like I'm some kind of monster. I never forced anyone to do anything. These women chose to believe me. Because you lied to them." Chloe sobbed. "You lied to all of us." "I told you what you wanted to hear," Blake shot back. "Don't blame me for your own desperation." That's when my Uncle Robert stood up. At 6'4" and with 30 years of construction work behind him, he was an imposing figure. "Son," he said in a voice like gravel, "you have about 10 seconds to apologize to my niece and get the hell out of here before I throw you out myself." Blake looked around the crowd, seeing nothing but hostile faces. Even the waitstaff was glaring at him. "Fine," he said, straightening his tie with shaking hands. "Chloe, we're leaving." But Chloe was already walking away, her emerald dress billowing behind her as she headed for the parking lot. "Don't follow me," she called over her shoulder. "Don't call me. Don't ever speak to me again." Blake stood alone in the center of the terrace, surrounded by the wreckage of his carefully constructed lies. For a moment, he looked almost pathetic. Then he turned to me one last time. "You think you've won," he said, "but you're just as broken as the rest of us." I walked over to him, close enough that only he could hear my words. "The difference between us, Blake," I said quietly, "is that I got better. You just got worse." He stared at me for a long moment, then turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing across the stone terrace until they faded into the darkness. The crowd watched him go in stunned silence. Then, slowly, the murmurs began again. People comforting each other, discussing what they'd just witnessed, trying to process the evening's revelations. I turned back to the microphone one final time. The silence that followed Blake's departure was profound. Not the uncomfortable quiet of earlier, but something deeper. The kind of silence that comes after a storm has passed and you're left standing in the aftermath, amazed that you survived. I looked out at the faces of my family and friends, seeing confusion, shock, and something else I hadn't expected: respect. These people had just watched me dismantle a man who had nearly destroyed me, and they were looking at me like they were seeing me clearly for the first time. "Well," I said into the microphone, my voice carrying easily across the terrace, "that wasn't exactly how I planned to spend my wedding reception." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. My mother was dabbing at her eyes again, but this time she was smiling. "I want to apologize," I continued. "I know this evening has been intense. This was supposed to be a celebration, not a courtroom. But sometimes the truth has its own timeline." Jonathan stepped up beside me, his hand finding mine. He squeezed gently, and I felt the last of my tension begin to fade. "3 years ago," I said, "I was a broken woman. My marriage had failed, my family had chosen sides, and I felt like I'd lost everything that mattered. I bought this vineyard because I needed somewhere to heal. Somewhere to remember who I was before I let someone else define me." I gestured to the rolling hills around us, the carefully tended vines that had become my sanctuary. I never imagined I'd find love again. But more than that, I never imagined I'd find myself again. And I definitely never imagined I'd be standing here on my wedding day, finally free from the lies that had haunted me for so long. The crowd was listening intently now, the earlier chaos replaced by genuine attention. "Jessica," I said, turning to the woman who had traveled across the country to help me expose Blake's lies, "thank you. Your courage tonight has probably saved other women from going through what we went through." Jessica nodded, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for giving me the chance to speak my truth. And Chloe," I continued, even though my sister was no longer there to hear me, "I hope someday you'll understand that I didn't do this to hurt you. I did it to protect you, and maybe to protect the next woman and the one after that." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of years of pain and anger finally lifting from my shoulders. "You know what the most beautiful part of tonight has been?" I asked. "It's not that Blake's lies were finally exposed. It's not even that justice was served. It's that I realized I don't need his validation anymore. I don't need his apology. I don't need anything from him at all." I turned to Jonathan, this wonderful man who had stood by me through everything, who had trusted me even when he didn't understand what I was doing. "What I need is right here," I said, bringing his hand to my lips. "A man who loves me for who I am. A life built on truth instead of lies. A future that belongs to us, not to ghosts from the past." The crowd began to applaud, slowly at first, then building to a thunderous ovation. But I barely heard it. All I could see was Jonathan's face, his eyes shining with love and pride. "So," I said, stepping back from the microphone and taking both of his hands in mine, "Jonathan Michael Harris, would you like to have our first dance? Our real first dance?" He laughed, that warm, wonderful sound that had first made me fall in love with him. "I thought you'd never ask, Mrs. Harris." The DJ, bless him, had apparently been following the entire drama with professional aplomb. The opening notes of At Last began to play again, and Jonathan spun me into his arms. As we danced, I could see the guests around us beginning to relax. Conversations resumed, laughter returned, and the waitstaff began moving again. The evening was transforming back into what it was always meant to be, a celebration of love and new beginnings. "I'm proud of you," Jonathan whispered in my ear as we swayed together. That took incredible courage. "I'm proud of us," I replied, "for building something real in a world full of Blake Morrisons." As the song ended, I looked around at the vineyard I'd built from nothing, at the friends and family who had stood by me, at the husband who had chosen to love me despite my complicated past. "Ladies and gentlemen," I called out, raising my champagne glass one more time, "I have one final toast." The crowd quieted, glasses raised expectantly. "To truth," I said, my voice carrying across the vineyard and into the star-filled sky. "To healing. To second chances and new beginnings. To the courage to love again, even after we've been broken." I paused, looking directly at the people who mattered most to me. And to the understanding that sometimes the best revenge is simply living well. The toast echoed across the terrace, voices joining together in celebration. As I sipped my champagne, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete peace. The ghosts were finally gone. The lies had been exposed. And I was exactly where I belonged, in the arms of a good man, surrounded by people who loved me, on the vineyard where I'd learned to love myself again. Blake was right about one thing. I had planned this. Not the confrontation, not the drama, but the life I was living now. The happiness I'd fought for. The love I'd earned. And it was perfect. As the evening wound down and guests began to say their goodbyes, I stood with Jonathan on the terrace, watching the last of the cars disappear down the winding driveway. "So," he said, pulling me close, "what do we do tomorrow?" I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in years. "Tomorrow," I said, "we start our happily ever after." And for the first time in my life, I truly believed it was possible.